Josephine Calder was 34 years old and sleeping on a church pew when the fire took the last of what she owned. It was Silas Rourke, the banker who ran half of Millhaven, Kansas, out of the back room of his mercantile, who had first spread the word that she was careless with a lamp, and it was that whisper, more than the flames themselves, that turned the town against her. All she had left after the ashes cooled was $4.60 sewn into the hem of her only remaining dress, and a stubborn refusal to leave the town her father had helped build. With that last handful of coins, she bought the abandoned schoolhouse on the edge of the prairie, sealed up and forgotten for 11 years. For $6 she did not entirely have, paying the difference in mended shirts. Folks called it a fool's bargain, a broken building for a broken woman. They did not know that behind its warped shelving lay a secret that would not only save Josephine Calder, but would call the whole town back to the promise it had forgotten it ever made. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calder. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, we hope you will tell us so in the comment below, because every forgotten place is a story still waiting to be told. Josephine had been born in that schoolhouse, or near enough has made no difference, for her father, Elijah Hale, had built it with his own hands in the spring of 1861, the same year the war back east began tearing at the country seams, and the same year he decided that whatever else came of the fighting, the children of Millhaven would learn their letters regardless. Elijah was not a wealthy man. He had come west with a wagon, a Bible, a chest of books, and a wife named Ruth who could sew a hem so fine it looked machine-stitched, though she never owned a machine in her life. Between the two of them, they raised Josephine to believe that a person's worth was not measured by the size of their house or the weight of their purse, but by what they built that outlasted them and what they were willing to give away. Elijah taught the town's children reading, arithmetic, and scripture in that one-room schoolhouse for 19 years, refusing pay from families who could not afford it, accepting eggs and firewood and mended harness instead, and Ruth kept the schoolhouse swept and the children's coats patched through winters so hard the well would freeze solid by December. Josephine grew up beneath the same roof, sitting cross-legged at the back of her father's classroom before she was old enough to hold a slate, memorizing the multiplication table before she understood what numbers were for, and learning, without anyone ever quite saying it aloud, that the schoolhouse was not simply a building. It was a promise the town had made to itself, that no child, however poor, would grow up unable to read a letter from a loved one or sign their own name to a deed. When Josephine turned 19, her father grew too weak to stand before the class each morning, his lungs worn thin from years of coal smoke and prairie dust, and it was Josephine who took up the chalk in his place, the town having no other candidate willing to teach for the wages a struggling settlement could offer. She taught for 11 years after that, through droughts that turned the wheat to dust and blizzards that buried the schoolhouse door up to its latch. Through the year the grasshoppers came in a cloud so thick they blotted out the sun and ate the crops down to bare date. Through births and deaths and every ordinary sorrow a small town carries without ever writing it down. She married briefly, at 26, a quiet freight driver named Daniel Calder who was killed 2 years later when his wagon overturned crossing the Cimarron in flood, and she buried him without children to comfort her, and went on teaching because it was the only thing she had left that felt like a reason to rise each morning. Her father died the winter she turned 30, and her mother followed him 18 months later, worn out from grief more than illness, and Josephine found herself, at 32, entirely alone in the world, save for the town itself, which she had come to think of, perhaps foolishly, as a kind of family. It was around this same time that Silas Rourke arrived in Millhaven with a bank charter in one hand and a surveyor's map in the other, promising the town that a spur line of the new railroad might be persuaded to run through it, if only the town would consolidate its scattered public lands under proper management, meaning his. He was a smooth-spoken man with a gold watch chain and a way of remembering everyone's name that made people trust him before they had any real reason to, and within 3 years he had bought up half the storefronts on Main Street and taken controlling interest in the other half through loans that came due faster than anyone expected. The schoolhouse itself sat on what the original town charter called the School Reserve Section, 40 acres set aside by the first settlers, Elijah Hale among them, expressly and permanently for education, and could not be sold, leased, or otherwise disposed of by any person or council. So the charter read, so long as the town of Millhaven should exist. Rourke wanted that section badly, for it sat squarely along the surveyed rail line, and a station house on that land would have made him a very rich man indeed. But the old charter, filed away in a strong box nobody could locate, stood between him and 40 acres of the most valuable ground in the county. The fire came on a dry night in late September, when the wind was blowing hard out of the southwest and every building on Boarding House Row was built of the same tinder dry pine. It began, so far as anyone could later determine, in the hayloft behind Agatha Voss's boarding house, where Josephine had been renting a small room since her mother's passing, having given up the little house she and Daniel once shared to help cover her mother's medical debts. Josephine woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of the bell in the Methodist steeple ringing wild and fast, and she had time only to grab her mother's Bible and the dress she was wearing before the stairwell filled with black smoke, and she had to climb down a rope of knotted bedsheets from the second-floor window, scorching her palms in the process. By morning, 6 buildings along the row had burned to their foundations, including the boarding house and every possession Josephine owned in the world, save the Bible and the dress and the coin sewn into its hem, money she had been saving, with a school teacher's discipline, toward a rainy day that had finally, catastrophically, arrived. It was Silas Rourke who stood in the ashes the next morning and, to no one in particular, though loudly enough for several to hear, wondered aloud whether the widow Calder had left the lamp burning again, the way she'd been known to do, grading papers late into the night. It was not true. Josephine had not lit a lamp in that hay loft in her life. But grief and fear make a town hungry for someone to blame, and Rourke's suggestion took root faster than the fire itself had, passed from porch to porch until by that evening half of Millhaven believed the school teacher had burned down Boarding House Row through simple carelessness, and the other half, though they did not quite believe it, were unwilling to say otherwise and risk offending the man who held the paper on their farms. Agatha Voss, who had lost her own home and livelihood in the blaze, was too consumed by her own ruin to defend her tenant, and within a week Josephine found that doors which had once opened readily now stayed shut, that the school board, quietly encouraged by Rourke, who now sat upon it, voted to suspend her teaching position pending an inquiry that everyone understood would never conclude, and that the only roof left to her was a hard wooden pew of the small Baptist church at the edge of town, where the pastor, an elderly, half-deaf man named Reverend Pruitt, allowed her to sleep so long as she was gone before the Sunday congregation arrived. She spent 11 days in that condition, washing at the hose trough behind the livery before dawn, mending clothes for the few families still willing to pay her a few coins of the wake, eating what Reverend Pruitt could spare from his own meager pantry, and turning over in her mind, again and again, the question of what a woman with nothing and nowhere does next. It was on the 11th day, walking the frozen road past the edge of town toward nowhere in particular, that she came again upon the old schoolhouse itself, the one her father had built, which had stood empty for 11 years since a newer, larger schoolhouse was constructed closer to the center of town, the old one left to the weather and the field mice, its windows broken, its roof sagging at one corner, its door hanging from a single hinge. She had not set foot inside it since she was a girl. She stood before it a long while in the cold, remembering her father's voice reading scripture over the heads of 40 children, remembering the smell of chalk dust and particular slant of afternoon light through the east windows, and something in her, some stubborn ember that the fire and the town's cruelty had not managed to extinguish, told her that this building, forgotten as it was not finished with its purpose yet. She went that same afternoon to the county land office, where she learned that the old schoolhouse and the half-acre immediately surrounding it, though technically still part of the larger school reserve, had been quietly separated from the main charter years before in a bureaucratic tidying up nobody had thought twice about, and had reverted, through an oversight in the county's records, to ordinary taxable property, available for purchase by any person willing to pay the back taxes owed upon it. The clerk, a kind young man named Ambrose, who remembered Josephine from her father's classroom, quoted her a price of $6 even, and when she counted out $4.60 from her hem and confessed she had no more, he hesitated only a moment before saying he supposed he could accept the balance in trade, if she happened to know how to mend a coat, for his own had a tear in the sleeve that had been bothering him for a month. And so, with her last coins and a promise of thread, Josephine Calder became the owner of the abandoned schoolhouse on the edge of Millhaven, Kansas, a building the town considered worthless, in the autumn of 1889. She moved into it that same evening, sweeping the mouse droppings from the floor by lantern light, stuffing rags into the broken window panes against the coming cold, and lying down that first night on a bed of a folded coat atop the old plank floor, more grateful for solid walls, however draughty, than she had ever imagined a person could be. It was in the second week of her occupancy, while attempting to pry loose a section of the built-in shelving along the north wall, warped and swollen with years of damp and therefore useless for holding anything, that she noticed the shelving unit did not sit flush against the wall the way the matching unit on the south side did. There was a gap behind it, no more than the width of 2 fingers, but a gap all the same. And when she worked the old iron pry bar her father had left behind into the seam and pulled, the entire shelf unit swung outward on a set of hinges so old and rusted they groaned like a dying animal, revealing a shallow recess built into the wall itself, a space no larger than a steamer trunk, plainly built with purpose and plainly meant never to be found by accident. Inside that recess sat a strong box of dark oil wood, bound in iron straps gone rusty at the corners, and beside it a bundle of oilcloth tied with twine that had gone brittle with age. Josephine's hands shook as she lifted them both free, and it took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light with fingers still scarred and healing from a fire, to work loose the twine and unwrap the oilcloth, inside of which she found a stack of letters in her father's own unmistakable hand, along with a leather-bound ledger she recognized, with a jolt that stole the breath from her chest, as the original founding charter of Millhaven School Reserve, the very document establishing that the 40 acres upon which the schoolhouse stood, and the newest schoolhouse besides, could never be sold or seized for any purpose but education so long as the town endured. The letters, dated across nearly 2 decades, told a story Josephine had never known in full. Her father, it seemed, had grown uneasy in his final years about the increasing number of land speculators drifting through Kansas with charters and surveys of their own, uneasy enough that when the county courthouse burned in a fire of its own in 1878, destroying the original recorded copy of the school reserve charter, Elijah Hale had quietly kept the sole surviving handwritten original hidden in the schoolhouse itself, along with copies of correspondence between himself and the Territorial Land Office confirming its legal standing, fearing correctly, as it turned out, that a document of such value, left in the hands of a town council that changed its composition every few years, might eventually find its way into pockets less honest than his own. He had told no one, not even Ruth, exactly where he had hidden it, only that it was safe, and that Josephine, being the one person he trusted absolutely to understand what it meant, would know what to do should the day ever come that the town's children needed protecting from men who valued the ground beneath the schoolhouse more than the learning that happened atop it. Beneath the letters and the charter, at the very bottom of the strong backs, Josephine found one thing more, a smaller pouch of oiled leather containing 41 gold and silver coins, a sum her father's letters explained had been collected, dollar by dollar, over nearly 2 decades from families too proud to accept charity outright, but willing to contribute quietly toward what Elijah called, in his own hand, a library and a teacher's wage fund, that no child in Millhaven need ever go without. Instruction for want of money, a fund he had never lived to establish, having died before he judged the sum sufficient, and having hidden it, like the charter, against the day it might be needed and the person he trusted might be found to use it rightly. Josephine sat on the cold floor of the schoolhouse until the lantern burned low, reading her father's letters twice through, understanding at last why the hidden compartment had been built so carefully, and understanding, too, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's hand upon her shoulder, exactly why it had waited 11 years to be found, and why it had been she, and not some stranger, who had finally pried the shelf away from the wall. She did not act rashly. She knew enough of Silas Rourke's influence over the town council, the bank, and half the county records office to understand that simply walking into town with an old handwritten charter would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny and delay that a man like Rourke could use to bury the truth a second time. So she spent the following days quietly, walking the 11 miles to the county seat of Larkspur to consult with an old friend of her father's, a semi-retired attorney named Cornelius Whitby, who had once, decades earlier, witnessed Elijah's original signature on township documents and could attest to its authenticity. Whitby examined the charter and the letters with the slow care of a man who understood exactly what was at stake, and confirmed what Josephine already suspected, that the document, properly refiled and cross-referenced against the surviving Territorial Land Office copies in the capital, would stand as ironclad proof that the entire 40-acre school reserve, including the very depot site Rourke had been quietly surveying, was legally protected from sale in perpetuity, rendering worthless every scheme Rourke had built toward bringing a rail spur and station house onto that particular ground. Word, however, has a way of traveling in small towns faster than any legal filing, and it was not long before Rourke learned, through a clerk in his own employ who had noticed Josephine's visits to the land office, that the school teacher he had ruined was making inquiries about old charters and boundary lines. He came to the schoolhouse himself on a cold morning in November, dressed in his good wool coat, smiling the same smile that had won him half the town's trust and mortgages both, and offered Josephine, with an ease that made her skin crawl, a sum of $200, a fortune to a woman who had recently owned nothing, for the half-acre and the schoolhouse itself, no questions asked, the papers ready to sign that same afternoon. When she declined, gently but without hesitation, his smile thinned, and he reminded her, in a voice gone quiet and hard, that a woman with her reputation, still under a cloud regarding the matter of the fire, might find that reputation grow considerably darker should she continue to make herself difficult, and that a town council grateful for a promised rail line might find itself quite willing to condemn an old, unsafe schoolhouse standing in the way of progress, charter or no charter, if the right words were whispered into the right ears. It was a threat, plainly enough, and Josephine understood it as one. But she had spent 11 days sleeping on a church pew and had discovered, somewhere in that cold and humbling stretch, that she had less to fear from a man like Rourke than he perhaps imagined. For a person who has already lost nearly everything finds that the leverage of threatened loss no longer moves her the way it once might have. She told him, with the same steady patience she had once used to calm a roomful of frightened children during a hailstorm, that she intended to file her father's charter with the county recorder within the week, and that she would be doing so publicly at the next meeting of the town council, so that every family in Millhaven might understand exactly what had been hidden from them and why. Rourke left without another word, but the set of his shoulders told the fight was not over, and indeed within 2 days a notice appeared, signed by 3 members of the school board he had quietly cultivated, declaring the old schoolhouse a public hazard subject to immediate condemnation and demolition, the notice conveniently dated to take effect the very morning before the town council was scheduled to meet. It was Ambrose Witt, the young land clerk who had once traded a mended coat for $6 of back taxes, who came to Josephine's aid at this critical hour, for he had grown fond of the school teacher who remembered his own school days fondly, and he understood better than most exactly how condemnation notices were meant to work, and how this one did not. He rode to Larkspur himself that same night to fetch Cornelius Whitby, and the 2 men returned before dawn with a formal legal filing, prepared and witnessed, halting the condemnation on the grounds that the property in question was, pending the town council's review of newly discovered evidence, potentially subject to a protective charter that predated the council's own authority to condemn it at all. It was a narrow, technical maneuver, the kind of thing that meant little to most townsfolk, but it bought Josephine the days she needed, and when the town council convened on a snow-threatened evening in early December, the meeting house fuller than it had been in years, word having spread that something significant was about to unfold, Josephine called a rose before her neighbors, many of whom had not spoken a kind word to her in weeks, and read her father's charter aloud in the same clear, patient voice she had once used to teach their children their letters. She read the letters too, or portions of them, enough to make plain the years of quiet devotion behind the founding of the school and the funds set aside for its future, and she watched, as she read, the faces in that room shift, slowly, from the guarded suspicion they had worn toward her since the fire, to something closer to shame, as families who had once trusted their children's education to Elijah Hale remembered, piece by piece, exactly what kind of man he had been, and exactly what kind of daughter he had raised. Cornelius Whitby stood and confirmed the charter's authenticity before the assembled council, and read into the record a letter he had obtained from the Territorial Land Office in the capital, confirming that the school reserve section had never legally been separated from its protected status, meaning that the earlier reversion allowing Josephine to purchase the old schoolhouse had itself been a clerical error, one that, awkwardly enough, meant technically the county owed her the $6 back, a detail that drew, despite the gravity of the evening, a ripple of surprised laughter through the room. It was left to Silas Rourke to answer for himself, and answer he did, red-faced and blustering, insisting the charter was a forgery, that the widow Calder could not be trusted, that this was precisely the sort of unstable behavior one might expect from a woman who had already burned down half of Boarding House Row. But it was Agatha Voss, of all people, who rose from the back of the room at those words, her own home still not rebuilt, her own losses still raw, and said in a voice that shook with an old woman's fury that she had lived above that hay loft for 15 years and had never once known Josephine Calder to leave so much as a candle burning unattended, that the fire, if truth be told, had started nearest a feed room where Rourke's own hired man kept lamp oil stored carelessly close to the hay. Fact, she had been too frightened and too grieved to speak aloud until this very moment, when she watched a good woman about to be slandered a second time in the same room, where the truth might finally set things right. The room went very still at that, and in the silence that followed, several other voices found their courage too. A stable hand who had seen Rourke's man drinking near the feed room that night, a widow who admitted she had only repeated a rumor about Josephine because Rourke himself had first suggested it to her at his own counter, and by the time the council adjourned that night, deeply after midnight, with snow finally beginning to fall outside the frosted windows, it was Silas Rourke's reputation, and not Josephine Calder's, that lay in ruins upon the meeting house floor. He did not stay in Millhaven long after that. Within a month, his bank quietly changed hands, sold under pressure from depositors who no longer trusted his name on their notes, and he left town before the spring thaw, headed, some said, toward a mining town in Colorado where a man with a gold watch chain and a smooth tongue might yet find fools willing to trust him before they had reason to. The rail spur, when it did eventually come through the county 2 years later, was routed instead along the northern edge of town, near the grain elevators, a far more sensible location that nobody, strangely enough, had thought to propose while Rourke still held sway over the surveyor's fees. As for Josephine, the town council voted unanimously, in the same December meeting that saw Rourke's disgrace laid bare, to restore her to her teaching position, and more than that, moved by the letters and the coins her father had hid away for 2 decades against exactly this need, to establish, using that same $41 in gold and silver as its founding gift, the Elijah Hale Fund for Millhaven's children, a standing account, administered jointly by the school board and by Josephine herself, dedicated to ensuring that no family in the town, however poor, need ever again choose between feeding their children and schooling them. The old schoolhouse itself, rather than being torn down, was repaired that following spring with volunteer labor from families who had once been too frightened of Rourke's influence to defend Josephine but who now came, plank and nail and paint in hand, eager to make amends, and it was reopened not as a town primary school, which remained in its newer building, but as a lending library and evening schoolroom for adults who had never learned to read, a purpose Josephine herself proposed, remembering her father's letters and his old dream of a library that belonged to everyone. And so it was that Josephine Calder, 34 years old, cast out and homeless after a fire she did not start, who had bought an abandoned schoolhouse for $6 she did not entirely have, found behind its warped and swollen shelving not merely a strong box of old papers and forgotten coins, but a proof of her father's quiet faith in her, and the means by which an entire town might be called back to a promise it had nearly let a smooth-tongued stranger erase. She had owned nothing, and had been believed by many to be worth even less than that, and yet the very thing the town had dismissed as worthless, an old, sagging, forgotten building on the edge of the prairie, had turned out to be the one place in all of Millhaven still holding, faithfully, in the dark behind its walls, exactly what the town most needed to remember about itself. It was not gold that saved Millhaven, though gold played its small part, and it was not vengeance that answered Silas Rourke's cruelty, though justice found him all the same. It was a hidden charter and a hidden fund and a woman willing to trust that what her father had built might yet serve a purpose neither of them could have fully foreseen, and it was a particular, patient courage of a school teacher who had lost everything and still believed, against every reason the town had given her not to, that the truth, properly taught, has a way of finding the light. We began this story by telling you that Josephine Calder was 34 years old and sleeping on a church pew when the fire took the last of what she owned, that she had $4.60 sewn into her hem, and that with it she bought a schoolhouse the whole town called worthless. We told you something was hidden there that would restore not only her, but the community that had turned its back on her. Now you know it was her own father's faith, folded into old letters and old coins and older law, waiting patiently behind a crooked shelf for the one person who would know exactly what to do with it. Millhaven remembers her still, not as a woman once blamed for a fire she never lit, but as a teacher who reopened a forgotten schoolhouse and, in doing so, reopened something in the town itself that had nearly gone dark for good. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Josephine's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more value than the world is willing to see at first glance. We would love to know, in the comments below, of a time you found real worth in something or someone that others had already written off. Until next time, Stay close.